speaker. We now have Carl Jorgensen of the Plant-Based Food Association, where he's the agricultural consultant. I am very excited, Carl, to have you with us today. And I will kick it straight over to you, and you can run off and show us some of the very exciting research you've been doing over the last couple of months.
Well, thank you, Marcel. And thanks for inviting the Plant-Based Foods Association to share its perspectives on this new, exciting, fast-growing industry of plant-based foods. I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me. All right, does everything look good?
I can confirm we can all see it and we can hear you. Perfect, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. First of all, it's a pleasure to follow Roquette. Roquette is actually a very prominent and very active member of the Plant-Based Foods Association, which is the first and at this point only trade association for the plant-based foods industry in the United States. And my comments today are going to be primarily US centric, mainly because that's where I work. This is the market that I'm involved in. But I think many of the perspectives that you'll hear today are applicable globally. Now, one of the things that we've learned in our research, our discussions with members of the Plant-Based Foods Association is that the majority of ingredients used in the manufacture of plant-based foods in the United States are imported. Actually, they're grown and or processed in other countries. And the challenge really for the industry is to make this opportunity available to American agriculture. Sometimes the plant-based foods industry has had a bit of a adversarial relationship with certain sectors of the agriculture community, particularly the plant and dairy industry. But really, plant-based foods, because they're growing so quickly, represent a potential opportunity for American agriculture. And so we are working with agriculture partners throughout the country to find ways to bring this opportunity back home, to reduce reliance on imported ingredients. Now, I just want to go over a little bit of ground that our previous presenter went over. It's just maybe looked at from a slightly different perspective. The plant-based foods sector really has been experiencing astronomical growth. According to data commissioned by PBFA from the data provider SPINS, US retail sales of plant-based foods grew by 27% in 2020. And this is really a continuation of the double-digit growth over the last 3 years. This growth was across every census region in the US and drove the industry to a valuation of $7 billion. US retail sales of plant-based foods grew by 27% in 2020. And that's really a continuation of double-digit growth over the last 3 years where we've been tracking retail sales. So one of the questions that often comes up, well, which categories are growing fastest? Which categories are biggest? What are the categories of plant-based foods? And this is probably the most detailed summary you'll see. And you'll see the two bars on the left, the two columns on the left, is for plant-based milk, by far the largest category of plant-based foods at retail. Keep in mind, we're talking about retail here. We're not talking about food service. We're not talking about any other category of sales. The data that we get from SPINS is from scan data at retail checkout. And then the second bar to the left is plant-based meats. The fastest growth is in plant-based milks. The second fastest growth is in plant-based meats. And you'll see that really this has an impact on which ingredients are of most interest to the industry and potentially to agriculture. Because really the crops and their derived ingredients used in the manufacture of these products has become of particular interest to those of us at PBFA who are researching potential opportunities for agriculture in the plant-based foods industry. So as I mentioned before, currently a majority of ingredients used in plant-based foods are made from crops grown outside of the US or from ingredients that were processed outside the US. And for reasons I'll discuss in a moment, PBFA is encouraging its members to develop domestic sources of these ingredients. And, you know, the theme of this conference and the theme of my talk is, you know, the barriers and the headwinds to potential future growth of this sector. And really one of them is over-reliance on imported ingredients. As we saw during the pandemic, and I'll go into more detail on this later, the fragility of global supply chains was exposed. And with these recent hacking incidents, the fragility of these supply chains has been pointed up even more. So this is really a very great interest to the plant-based foods industry in the US. Now, the major ingredients that we're of concern that we're talking about is, first of all, soy. And, you know, in all its forms, both from right from the farm, but, you know, in its whole form, but, you know, then it's increasingly processed derivatives such as flour, textured soy protein, protein concentrate, protein isolate, and so forth. The next one in terms of volume is dry yellow peas. And again, in all its forms, whole peas, pea flour, concentrate, isolate, and so forth. And the reason I mention whole here is that this is actually a beginning trend, but which we believe will eventually become a substantial trend of using whole foods rather than extractions or highly processed ingredients in plant-based foods. Next ingredient of interest, chickpeas, which is a very fast rising protein source. And then wheat, primarily as a source of protein in the form of wheat gluten. It's actually a very traditional ingredient in plant-based foods. Some of the first products and what we would call the first generation of plant-based foods were soy and wheat gluten products. And then finally, oats. And of course, oats, there's so much action around oats, so much news about oat milk. And as we'll discuss, oats have a real role to play in sustainable agriculture. And, you know, PBFA and the plant-based industry in general wants to align itself with more sustainable methods of agriculture. A core principle of plant-based eating is that it's easier on the planet. Well, the way in which the ingredients for the plant-based foods products are grown should also be easier on the planet. So we support the principles of organic and regenerative agriculture, and in particular, moving farmers toward more diverse products off the farm, growing more crops, More crop opportunities means more diverse crop rotations. And as research has shown, this promotes soil health. We created a tool for manufacturers, companies in the plant-based foods industry that will make it easier for them to partner with farmers, to partner with agriculture. You know, we're encouraging members of the plant-based foods industry to start pilot projects, domestic sourcing, to take one or two primary ingredients and begin looking at what it would take to reduce dependency on imported sources for these ingredients and develop domestic supply chains. And we're providing assistance and advice to our members to help them develop these supply chains. And as part of that, we needed a tool which would help determine how many acres are needed to produce particular ingredients. You know, early on in our dialogue with leaders in the agriculture community, we were asked, well, what is the size of the opportunity? You know, well, how many acres are we talking about here? And we honestly didn't have an answer for that. We had lots of data on retail sales, but we didn't have a way of saying, for example, with oat milk, how many acres were needed to produce the amount of oat milk that's being sold. And so we worked with agricultural economists at the University of Illinois, led by Dr. Gary Schnittke, to develop a way to translate retail sales to farm level demand expressed in acres. The methodology developed by Dr. Schnittke and his team is a tool that companies can use to make business decisions when setting up domestic supply chains that begin with farmers. Knowing the retail sales of their own products, they can now calculate how many acres of crops used to manufacture their ingredients their farmers will need to plant. Companies will be able to write contracts for specific numbers of acres, something that farmers need for planning their own planting programs. Contracts make it easier for farmers to borrow money for seeds and equipment. And here's an example of the methodology applied to oats, specifically knowing the 2020 retail sales of oats. And I won't go into all the details. This is kind of a summary of the final numbers of how we arrive at the number of acres needed to support sales of $268.5 billion of oat milk. And, you know, 9,386 acres seems like a small amount of acres, and it is in terms of the total oat crop in the US. But think about it. When oat milk achieves a 20% share of the fluid milk market, the opportunity for American agriculture will go up to 96,700 acres of food grade oats needed to meet demand. And this is not an unreasonable projection, as plant-based milks of all types right now, including almond milk, oat milk, soy milk, etc., already comprise 15% of total fluid milk sales. So presently, the Plant-Based Foods Association is in dialogue with its members on their ingredient sourcing challenges and on their barriers that they face. And unsurprisingly, price was found to be the top selection driver in selecting ingredient providers. Members indicated that the three most important considerations around price are finding the most cost-effective option, seeking price stability or at least ample notice of price changes, and concern about supply chain interruptions. Digging a little deeper, the survey revealed that pricing does not affect the sourcing decision if ingredients are necessary, specific, or unique to products. Pricing does affect the decision to source, but it needs to meet quality standards and specifications first. Pricing decisions follow a cost analysis based on how important the ingredient is to the overall product, or how large a portion that ingredient is of their overall product. The current price advantages that foreign producers have over US producers is reflected in the finding that 90% of plant-based ingredient suppliers are sourcing both domestically and internationally. The global COVID-19 pandemic brought the inherent fragility of global supply chains into sharp relief. Some of the shortages caused by workplace restrictions and port quarantines are continuing, such as the current global chip shortage that is affecting vehicle manufacturing. Plant-based foods companies that are sourcing globally express concern about supply chain disruptions, which lead not only to shortages, but also to price increases. These disruptions make it difficult to plan in a sector where crop seasonality is always part of the equation. PBFA advocates for creating domestic supply chains wherever possible to reduce the greater risks of disruption inherent in global supply chains. Of course, the challenge is to create the conditions in country that will achieve price parity with foreign producers. Through a combination of government policy work and domestic supply chain innovation, PBFA is working towards the day when domestic sourcing is competitive in the global marketplace. One interesting bit of nuance that emerged from the member survey was a risk that no amount of planning can fully anticipate: the changing attitudes and behaviors of consumers. So here's a specific example to illustrate the inherent risks of global supply chains. And this chart is courtesy of Mintech. Thank you very much. And these are pea protein isolate prices out of China. And they show a price spike starting in the beginning of November 2020 that was exacerbated by the COVID-induced global container shipping crisis. You may remember that many ships were quarantined on arrival at ports around the world, leading to sharp increases in container shipping costs. Container freight rates increased from $2,000 per container to well over $10,000 per container. China is a major manufacturer of pea protein isolate, and the container shipping cost increase directly affected the cost of pea protein, a major ingredient used by many of PBFA's biggest members. So thank you for your attention, and back to you, Marcel.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to get my video to work, but not just yet popping up there. Anyway, people can hear me. That's the most important part and probably the prettier one for the eye anyway, if I can't be seen. Oh, unfortunately, bad news for you guys. I'm back up. We've got a couple of questions there. As I said, very interesting indeed. But let's kick off with, because I think the stuff that you guys do is just so fascinating and so important for the industry. Do you just want to spend 15 seconds on how to join the PBFA and obviously what the benefits and values that people can get out of it?
Yes, PBFA's membership now is around 200 brands or manufacturers of plant-based protein and ingredient supplier companies. In fact, ingredient supplier companies is now the fastest growing membership category in PBFA. It's really interesting. And I think one of the reasons is that a trade association provides a forum where buyers and sellers can meet. And very naturally, ingredient companies want to meet the buyers of their products. And then we have affiliate memberships, people who are neither ingredient companies nor brands or manufacturers, but play a supporting role in the industry, either through research, sales, consulting, so forth, or advocacy. And there's vegan groups, agriculture groups, there's even animal rights groups that are associate members. So it's a very diverse community. For membership information, please visit our website, plantbasedfoods.org. And along the top, click on membership, and it'll provide all the information you need to join PBFA.
Fantastic, amazing, and obviously we are an affiliate member as well at Mintech. Now, kind of going through some of the questions, quite a few in the chat box we've got at the moment, guys. Obviously, feel free at the Q&A at the bottom to submit more. One question I wanted to ask, and I think it goes back to the pricing chart you've just shown again. Thank you for that. You showed the Chinese graph, and I think talking more about the plant-based protein prices, certainly on the P side, the Chinese prices are at the moment anyway the cheapest. We can go into more detail about why. If anybody wants to know, happy to give the information on that. But that does maybe move people towards buying more Chinese rather than buying domestic. What do you think needs to happen for people to buy domestic? Or would you even say that from what you're hearing from your members, that actually price isn't as important, it is having something domestically sourced, and then it's fine to pay more money for it?
Very interestingly, most of the membership is not that interested in paying even a slight premium for the privilege of sourcing domestically. They want the prices to be globally competitive, because it affects their price on the shelf and therefore directly affects their sales. One of the headwinds, one of the barriers to domestic sourcing, in this case of pea protein, was really the lack of processing capacity in the United States. You have a situation now for a number of years where the peas would be grown and harvested and shipped to China, where they would be processed into concentrates and isolates. And then those ingredients would be shipped back to the United States for inclusion in plant-based products. This is a crazy situation, but it's actually fairly typical of today's global economy. What's happening, though, is that the private sector, the industry is stepping up and actually bringing more processing capacity online in the United States. A very recent and notable example of that is the ingredient company Ingredion, which has opened a major pea protein processing facility in South Sioux City, Nebraska. And this, is an important step forward in creating a domestic capability of protein product production.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think obviously there's also, we've just heard from Roquette right there, I think doing some fantastic work over there in Canada. But you've mentioned or touched upon a good point there in terms of like it being shipped back and forth, right? And it's actually, for those with us, I think in our second last session, we're going to look more into that. Some of the extra trade flows going from Canadian peas going into China, being used for animal starch. And then the protein being used obviously for the plant protein work, and then actually coming back into Europe or back into China, which does beg the question around the whole ESG part around it, right? If we're saying, hey, there's so much emissions behind the meat value chain, if we are shipping plant-based proteins and the peas twice across the world, then what are we really doing here? Is it a little bit wrong to go that way? But price is king, as you said.
That's right. One of the claims about the advantage of plant-based eating is it reduces your carbon footprint. It reduces the impact on the planet of acquiring and consuming protein. And so something like these shipping products back and forth from North America and Asia certainly doesn't help that proposition. So bringing sourcing back home, creating shorter domestic supply chains, of course, is supportive of the overall mission of plant-based foods.
Absolutely. It's I think one of the last questions I want to ask in this session before we then move on, and again we can answer all of your questions afterwards. We know Americans like to eat meat, right? It's one of these big things about tailgating, having your barbecue after a football match. What do you think the appetite is in America on the bigger scale, right? We know obviously there's certain clusters, there's certain people that are really driving it, but from what you were hearing, do you think we're close to getting really to that tipping point or flipping point? There's obviously some call industry, or do you think we're still light years away from it?
I think we have a ways to go before there's a tipping point, but we're moving there quickly. I mean, if you just look at the double digit annual growth of uh, consumption of plant-based foods by American consumers, that we can see that we're heading toward that tipping point. And I mentioned early on that right now plant-based milks um, are almost a quarter of market share of, or approaching a quarter of market share of fluid milk. I mean, that's enormous. So, you know,
And is that in
I
America in particular, or is that a global
America, in
phenomenon?
America. Now, Europe actually got an earlier start on plant-based milks than U.S. I haven't seen the figures on what the penetration is in Europe, but I imagine it's comparable or better.
I don't have the exact figures behind, I must admit, but yeah, it could be there. Although obviously, in Europe, you're not allowed to call them milks, drinks in Europe. Carl, fantastic. Thank you so much, obviously, for your time. Really enjoyed talking to you.